So what I wanted to begin with was what drew you towards social psychology, Vanessa?
Towards social psychology. It's interesting because I was a psychology major in undergrad and was always interested in psychology in general. And I could never really figure out what kind of psychology I was going to go into. I worked in a sleep lab. I actually worked in 2 different sleep labs, and I found that fascinating. And I actually wanted to be a sleep researcher for the longest time, which would be like biopsychology. But it turns out that you have to stay up late at night often when you're a sleep researcher. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to cut that out. And then I just kind of tried out a bunch of things and fell in love with social psychology. I don't even know exactly why. I'd say there's a clearer path to how I started studying social influence, but social psychology just kind of was like, this is just so interesting and the experiments are so fun. Yeah.
It must have come across as some kind of a subliminal calling, We thought
Maybe.
as realizing it, there is a gravitational pull that takes you there, and you find comfort there, you find happiness there, and you go with the flow, so to speak.
Quite possible.
Yeah, lovely. So what do you think, Vanessa, are the pros and cons of being on, we are always on, right? In the switched on ecosphere, both for individuals and organizations. And as they would say in psychology, maybe, is availability bias to blame?
So availability bias to blame for being always on?
Yeah.
So actually availability bias refers to something different in cognitive psychology, which is a specific bias of whatever's top of mind is the thing you think of. So I think it's something different, actually. I think it's a norm that really creates this need to be constantly available. There's this idea that we're supposed to be ideal workers, and it's sort of a new modern kind of norm about the workplace where we're supposed to prioritize our work over all else. We prioritize it over our family, over our life. We were talking about work-life balance earlier. And I think what happens is that we think if we don't, drop everything to respond to, an email from a colleague or an email from our boss, that we're somehow suggesting we're not an ideal worker, right? And we're not as good as other people. We won't rise up in our career the way that, we'd like to. So I do think it's this norm and this pressure that it creates.
Okay, and probably status anxiety, FOMO, I think all of that might be coming into the mix.
It could be. If anything, I'd say even just structurally, the fact that we have phones with us all the time that connect us to work, there's this idea that if I have it and I don't respond, that means something, right? So even beyond me, like missing out on something, someone else is going to be judging me because they know I have my phone, they know I have access, right? And so I think we get ourselves into this idea that we have to respond all the time. Otherwise, we're going to be judged negatively. And it turns out that's not true, right? So we have some research showing that, in fact, people don't judge us as negatively as we think, and people don't expect us to respond so quickly.
Absolutely. And I read some interesting articles that you've written about in terms even responding on emails, the speed with which you respond, the content that you use, the subject line that you use. Actually, you're probably coming in your own way, because the expectation on the other side is not so acute or extreme. But I think probably we feel that guilt of responding and therefore we are always on probably, as a result of that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's what our research shows, that there's a disconnect between the person who's sending the email and waiting for a response. They're okay with waiting a little bit, and then getting that email, hearing that ding in your inbox and feeling like, oh my God, I have to get back to this person right away.
Right. Absolutely. Well, this is now the flavor of the season, the avalanche of the Great Resignation. And do you think organizations could have sensed or avoided it? Would the new wave be a culture of recognition and retention? What are your thoughts?
I think this is a really interesting period of time because people are in this place where they can step back and reassess what they want out of work. And I think that a lot of employers, initially are just like, well, we need to give these tangible things. We need to, make sure we're paying people enough. which I mean is always a good thing. We need to, think about flexible workplace, opportunities, which is also a good possibility right now. But it's easy to kind of go to these tangible things and forget that people leave work for lots of other reasons. One of the most common being that there's a toxic workplace culture, that there's people that are difficult to work with, that there's bosses who are difficult to work with. And so I think that one sort of important thing for employers and organizations to think about is how they're shaping not just the tangible outcomes, like what can we give, our employees, but what kind of culture are we creating? How are we talking to our employees about things like psychological safety and respect for one another, especially in a hybrid environment where a lot of new sort of complications come up.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what are the big Eureka moment, the inspiration that triggered you to write You Have More Influence Than You Think? There must have been some, or was it kind of brooding over a period of time?
I will say, I was writing this book in my head for years. It was just kind of in the background, I think. And while I kind of was just accumulating all of my own research and noticing similar trends in other people's research, I was also noticing more and more the sort of influence book landscape and the fact that there's so many books out there that's like, here's how to get more influence. Here's 5 tips for getting more influence. It's all about gaining, gaining, gaining. And my research and the research I was really paying attention to is all like, look at all this influence we already have. Look how much people shape one another's behaviors and experiences in these very subtle ways, but ways that have really big impacts. And I started to see sort of this place for a book like that, sort of this accumulation of knowledge I'd been kind of putting together in my head of like, oh, here's the string of things that have a similar sort of takeaway. And it is a new perspective that's just not in that influence sort of landscape. And so that's, I think once that congealed, I really kind of pretty quickly was able to think about what that book would look like and put it together.
Just as a small aside, we interviewed Amanda Russell last summer. She had written a book called The Influencer Marketing Code. And I think she teaches a course on the same subject at the Kellogg Northwestern University. It was last summer, I think last August, if I'm not mistaken. I'm sure, apart from all these things that was kind of brooding and brewing in your head, you've undertaken a lot of research for the book. Can you just tell us a little bit of the story, the roadmap that you took for the research?
Sure. So when I first started as a graduate student at Columbia and sort of began my path in social psychology, I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. And you kind of, in the initial years, you're kind of trying to figure out, what's my dissertation going to be on? What's my research program going to be on? And I was working with a professor there, Frank Flynn, at the business school. And we were doing a study. We had this hypothesis, and to test it, I had to go collect data. And so I would go down to Penn Station, take the subway down each day, go up to people.
34th and Penn, huh?
What?
34th and Penn, right?
Yeah. And I would go in, with my little stack of questionnaires and go up to people and say, hey, will you fill out a questionnaire? And it was such a horrible experience. I just hated asking people for things over and over and over. It was the worst. But at the same time, as much as it was so painful in my head, I realized that people were so much more receptive and willing and warm than I expected. And so when I went back to Frank and we started sort of looking at the data, we realized our initial hypothesis, it really wasn't working out the way we had hoped. But we also talked about my experience of just going down there. I was like, this was awful. And then we looked at the data and we were like, but so many people agreed. So why was it so awful? And we started to get into this idea that how we think influences in our heads is quite different from how it winds up being. And that, we have this idea that you're going to be rejected. People are going to be annoyed at you. People are just inclined to say no, right? But in fact, so many people were inclined to say yes. It was hard for them to say no. And so we started running studies on that and putting our participants in the same position I was in Penn Station and having them go out and make requests, guess how hard it would be to get people to say yes. And we kept finding over and over. At this point, we've had people ask 15,000 people for things.
Wow.
And they regularly think that it's going to be harder and they're going to get more rejections than they actually get.
And you were doing this at the time of the morning or the evening rush? Was there a specific time that you were doing it at Penn Station?
It was all hours of the day.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that is an interesting idea, is that, I think when we picture what it would be like, we think of like people rushing around. But even in that rush, there's people sitting down waiting for their trains. And I think we have this idea that it's going to be one way, but when we get there, we actually pinpoint the people who are sitting down, who are, have nothing else to do and are quite willing to say yes.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, just to expand the thought and the core ethos that you're trying to bring out in the book, and feel free to push back. What you're saying is we are all missing the wood for the trees, so to speak, right? There is enough intrinsic ability, power, aura, charisma that we have, but we somehow are very, very apprehensive about bringing that to life, bringing that into the open. Is that what you're kind of actually articulating?
I think so. I think it's a basic sort of underconfidence is how I would talk about it, that we are underconfident in the extent to which people will listen to us if we speak up, the extent to which people like us and, are paying attention to sort of our general being and the positive things we'd like them to pay attention to. And we think they're paying attention to all the things we wish they wouldn't pay attention to. We expect more rejection than we actually get, but people are actually quite willing to help us and, as you mentioned, like us more than we think. So yeah, I think all of that can do one of two things. It can prevent us from saying anything or asking for anything or feeling like we have any influence, and it can really hold us back because we underestimate, the influence we could have if we acted on it in very subtle ways, On the other hand, it can make us kind of come out guns blazing if we want to have influence, because we don't realize that our subtle influence is really powerful, and we can think we have to need to like shout, or really push if we want something to happen, when in fact, usually it's a lot simpler than that.
So do you see this as the other side of psychological safety, which we are trying to encourage in organizations? So maybe the entire zeitgeist, so to speak, the ecosystem should be all about, you don't need to feel underconfident, your authentic self is good enough, articulate, share, coerce, convince, I think it might happen naturally. And probably you're not giving yourself the credit that you deserve.
I think so. And I think a lot of the things that come into play when there's not psychological safety, when is like competition and judgment and criticism in a particular culture, a lot of it does come down to self-consciousness, people feeling like they have something to prove, people thinking that they need to show that they're, smarter than the next person, that they deserve to be there, that they have this, status, for example. And I think that a lot of that could be sort of tempered if we all realize that actually people already are listening to you. You don't have to prove things so much. And that if we all, as you mentioned, like could just be our authentic selves, that actually we give ourselves a lot of the benefit of the doubt when we're not constantly worried about like what we have to prove and how other people are judging us. And so I think it would help in that way too.
Just to borrow something from Robert Cialdini, what separates effective communicators from powerful persuaders?
So I think there's a few things. So one is that we find in our studies that people think that the best way to persuade someone or get someone to do something for them is to sort of beat around the bush and hint at something, sort of be indirect about it. And I think that's being polite. And I think, I don't want someone to help unless they really want to.
Like those email subject lines or whatever.
Yeah, like email subject lines, or like, I really could use a ride to the airport, or whatever it might be. This kind of just hinting, right? Not actually come out and saying, I need this help. Could you do this for me? And I think what happens is that then the other person, we're really bad at understanding if someone, are you asking me for that? We don't quite get what someone's getting at unless they come out and actually say it and tell us clearly and directly, not rudely, just clearly what they would like. And so I think effective communicators are able to ask for something clearly and directly, say like, I would really like this, in a way that's not sort of rude or overwhelming, right? That still doesn't make someone feel like they're put in a bind where they can't say no. So I think that's a big part of it.
Okay. You're looking at in the book a lot of science-based strategies for observing the effect we have on others. And I'm sure you've kind of gone through it with a fine-tooth comb. You want to actually share some examples of the experience?
Sure. Yeah. So, one of the takeaways that I'd really like people to get from the book is these sorts of strategies you can use to become more aware of the impact you have on other people. Because, as I talk about, we tend to look out at the world and we see all the ways that other people are affecting us and all the ways that other people are affecting each other. And we can say, like, I don't know why this situation is happening the way it is. But as we look out through our own two eyes, we don't see ourselves and how we're contributing to that dynamic, the things we're putting out into the world that might also be creating a certain, situation, be it problematic or otherwise. And so part of the idea is to become more mindful of what you're doing that other people are reacting to potentially. And so I talk about a couple of ways to do that. One is simply getting out of our own heads. And so there's actually some research showing, for example, Eli Finkel, a researcher at Kellogg, he talks about how couples, right, married couples, they usually have this decrease in marriage satisfaction over time. And he did this study.
It has got nothing to do with economics, huh? It has nothing to do with. It has got nothing to do with economics. Law of diminishing marginal satisfaction.
It maybe. But he came up with this this intervention where he just had them newlywed couples, and sort of their first or second year of marriage, I believe, just write 3 times a year about arguments that they had from a third party perspective. Just imagine how someone watching would think about this argument. In that way, you could see both people. You see what your spouse is doing that's annoying you, but you also see what you're doing as part of it. And so he finds that actually prevents this dip in marital dissatisfaction, right? So people actually stay pretty steady in terms of marital satisfaction when they do this really simple writing exercise 3 times a year. And so one way that we can all sort of become more mindful of our influence more generally, not just in close relationships, but in all sorts of interactions, is to try this, to either do a little writing exercise or try to sort of imagine yourself as a fly on the wall, looking at the situation and making sure you're seeing what you're doing, right? So that's one thing. Another thing I talk about is something called getting perspective. And so there's a lot of sort of emphasis on taking perspective. So even Dale Carnegie of How to Win Friends and Influence People talks about, like, you should take people's perspectives, right? The thing is that when we try to take people's perspectives, we often get it wrong because we're guessing what they think, right? And it's based on our own experiences, which might be different. It's based on our own stereotypes and ideas about the other person, which might be wrong. And so the research actually shows that it's much better to do something really simple called getting perspective. And that's actually to ask people, how do you feel about this? How did you interpret this thing I said? And the more we can have this open communication, it seems so simple, right? But the more we can have this open communication, not guess how other people are feeling about something, the more we're aware of the way we actually are impacting other people.
In fact, just last week, we were doing a conversation with Rory Sutherland and Pete Dyson. They had released a new book, Transport for Humans, So one of the thoughts that we were sharing and conversing on was that, do you think, social psychology or a behavior science for that matter, should be mainstream up front and center schools and colleges in the K-12 onwards, because I think all of this could be dovetailing beautifully into even when urban planning and engineers and government bureaucrats are planning something it's not top down, it is actually ground up.
Yeah, I always found it so interesting that I never learned about this stuff until college. And then it was an elective, it wasn't something you had mandatory to learn about. Yeah. So, I definitely think the more we can understand, we're seeing even, with the pandemic and all sorts of other social issues that, like, you have to understand how people make decisions. You have to understand behavioral science to some degree to understand what's happening in the world. And so I do think it should be a more sort of central piece of education for sure.
Right. I think the flavor of the season seems to be STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. And it is coming at the cost of all this, maybe even culture, anthropology, history, and a lot of it, maybe a balanced mix could make it far better, I guess.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
What do you see, Vanessa, the power of storytelling in persuasion and inspiration? You're a storyteller yourself now with book one, and then I'm sure you're doing a lot of writing, and the sequels are on the way. So what do you think is the power of storytelling in inspiring and persuading people?
Yeah, this is another really interesting question, because people's intuitions, right, when they want to persuade someone, are to give them all the facts, right? But it turns out that, not surprisingly, facts don't really convince people.
Human beings are
Stories
not
and
rational.
emotions do. Yeah. So it is a huge part of persuasion, being able to kind of, first of all, get someone to care about what you're trying to persuade them on, right? To get that emotional connection and to make them feel like they want to see the ending of the story. And so I definitely think storytelling is a huge part of persuasion, and a highly under sort of valued part of persuasion.
Right, absolutely. In fact, I realized it later on, very late. So, in fact, if you look at my visiting card, I've given myself the privilege, in quotes, of being the chief storyteller.
I did see that. Yeah.
Okay, so a lot of people actually, what I noticed also was post, because earlier the designation was something else, and okay, yeah, this is an interesting title. So you begin, it's an icebreaker. People kind of probably lower their defenses. There is a natural warming up. Hey, listen, you're also the guy next door or the girl next door. We are all immortals and human beings from the same planet. So there is nothing that that is I mean, I'm out of access, or you're not intimidated or overwhelmed. It's a level playing field. I think it creates a starting point, is what my experience has been.
Yeah, I think so. And I also think, I mean, the research shows, and Bob Cialdini shows this as well, that we don't want to feel like we're being influenced, right? If we're aware that, like, oh, someone's trying to persuade me or coerce me or something, all of a sudden we put all our sort of defenses up. But if we're just listening to a story, as you said, that kind of opens people up, it warms people up. They feel like engaged and willing to kind of continue on that path and not just immediately kind of shut it down.
Right. So, you're in a beautiful space wherein I think you're regularly engaging with university students, and what in your experience are the areas of optimism that they have, and what are the areas of, apprehensions and concerns that they come with?
Yeah, I mean, this has definitely been a weird time, though, to see university students. They're much more stressed out, I'd say, than usual. I'd say that sort of the usual stresses and apprehensions I see are about, what is my life going to be? And I have these long conversations often with my students about this idea of just setting yourself up for some sense of serendipity, going with the thing that sounds interesting to you and assuming that is not, the long-term thing you're going to be doing forever. But you'll learn something from it. You'll meet people from that. And eventually you will probably switch and find something else. And kind of, I feel like a lot of their apprehension is not having everything planned out long term, right? Not being willing to sort of take an initial step that might not be what they want to do forever, and have faith that at some point, that's going to take them somewhere where they are happy, for example. In terms of their optimism, I mean, it's great. I feel like this is something that happens with most generations, right? But they definitely, in my experience, especially here at the ILR school at Cornell, they definitely feel like they can change the world. They have this sense of frustration with a lot of things, but also, at least the way I experience them, there is this empowerment. There is this sense of confidence in terms of changing things that they find, upsetting, or things that they feel are wrong in the world. And so I'd say that's definitely another sort of piece that's always inspiring to me to see before you get all jaded and you're like, nothing's ever going to change.
No, wasn't it Tom Peters who mentioned that you better be frustrated and angry if you want to change the world?
Yeah, I think, I teach a class on morality. And one of the things we talk about is anger as a moral emotion. That like anger gets this bad rap. Like you're not supposed to be angry. You're supposed to go to anger management and hold it in and all these things. And it's kind of almost a joke, anger, but it's truly a moral emotion. It inspires us to change things that we think are wrong. And so we talk about the moral value of anger.
Yeah, you must have read about this book. I don't want to spell it out because it comes with a little bit of an expletive. I will send you over the mail, written by Faith Harper. And coincidentally, I just heard this podcast this morning with Dr. Laurie Santos from the Happiness Lab,
Yeah.
all about anger. I'll send you it on a mail. All right.
Okay.
A very interestingly titled book. So you must have unearthed so many powerful tools, when you did all this groundwork and scavenging and research for the book. What is, in your understanding and experience, one of the most powerful tools that you've taken away, in your own experience for your own?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say one is definitely what we mentioned earlier, which is to be clear about what you need from someone or what you're asking for, and not to beat around the bush, because it's okay. People actually appreciate being able to help if they can, and they can't help if they don't know exactly what you need, right? Another one, which I found just incredibly powerful, is to have conversations where you're asking for something, or where it's a difficult conversation, in person whenever possible, if not in person, over the phone or Zoom. Because email, not surprising, although it was surprising to our participants in many of our studies, email is just a terrible medium for getting things you want, right? We often think like, oh, I can write a perfect email and convince someone of exactly what I want them to do, when in fact, emails are just so easy to ignore. No one reads them all the way. No one puts the effort into reading an email that you put into writing an email. And so I'd say staying off email as much as possible when I'm having important conversations or need to ask for something is another powerful thing. And then I'd say the third one is learning how to say no. I think I struggle with that quite a bit. I feel so guilty every time I say no. And, finding ways in which I have my go-to scripts where I find ways to say no, but still create value for, the relationship and the other person. So that I don't feel so bad about it, and I can actually protect my time a little bit and do the things that I actually want to do, and not just everything people are asking me to do.
So they call that in psychology the sandwich approach.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So coming towards the tail end of this, one last question that I had, Vanessa, for you. Can you name some authors and books that have really inspired you as you kind of came along in life, and that has helped you professionally, and something that you always look forward to and get inspiration from?
I mean, a book I always go back to is Bob Cialdini's, of course. I mean, that book was brilliant. The new version is brilliant, the updated version. And
now it's got eight tenets, right? Now, was it seven?
Right. Or yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, that's just a perennial amazing book. My good friend from graduate school, I loved his research ever since, we were in graduate school, what was it, almost 20 years ago. And now he has a book out, Chatter, which was a nice refresher on all the research that I had always used for many years to help myself. So I'd say that book as well has been really helpful.
I think we've interviewed, I forget the gentleman's name,
Ethan Cross.
Yes, yeah. we've interviewed him. I'll send you the link as well. Lovely, okay. lovely. So thanks so much, Vanessa. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we'll stay in touch. Thank you for doing this for us, and I will send you the links once it is uploaded and packaged. Okay. Perfect. Thanks so much. Good. Take care. Good luck. Bye-bye.
Great to meet you. Thank you.
Same here. Thank you.